Don't have anything. Matt, you want to start us off?
All right. Sure. Can you explain exactly what the the waivers the Secretary signed on Friday?
Sure. So the waivers that the Secretary signed on Friday that were notified to Congress yesterday were to effectuate the transfer of funds from accounts in South Korea, Iranian funds that have been held in accounts in South Korea, through accounts in Europe, ultimately to accounts in Qatar, where they will be available for use for humanitarian transactions with strict Treasury Department oversight, and ultimately there to, as we said before, effectuate the release and bring home 5 American citizens who have been wrongfully imprisoned in Iran.
Okay. Can you explain why these waivers were necessary? Because it's my understanding that the administration did not believe, and had told the European banks, even though they were extremely leery of being involved in any kind of conversion of money or transfer of money, and they didn't want to do it. So is that why the waivers were finally granted, and why it took so long? This deal was announced back in, over a month ago.
It's a good question. Let me explain it with a little background context, which is that I think you're aware of all this, but some others may not be, which is the $6 billion.
I am aware of it. I know the answer, but
know,
the fact of the matter is that no one in the administration has spoken to the record on this.
Exactly, which is why I want to explain it.
I want to get into the NSC comments from last night.
That there were $6 billion that were held in these funds. The previous administration set up these accounts, or allowed these accounts to be set up so countries could purchase Iranian oil. The money would then go into these accounts. Iran has always been able, under the regime set up by the previous administration, to access the funds in these accounts. And in other places, we saw them spend down the funds in these accounts, accounts that were set up for purchases of oil, for example, from in India or Brazil. And under the previous administration, were spent down with no restrictions at all. When this administration took office, we put restrictions on these accounts to ensure that they could only be used for humanitarian purposes. However, a number of banks, despite the assurances we had given, did not want to participate in transactions related to these accounts. So it was necessary for the Secretary to make these waivers to allow the transfer of money from these accounts through bank accounts in Europe, ultimately to Qatar.
Why did it take so long then for you guys to come around to deciding that, okay, this isn't going to happen unless we actually do the waivers?
I would just say this has been a complicated process from the beginning. As you can imagine, dealing with all of the moving pieces and dealing with moving this money from accounts in Korea, where it had to be converted into euros, ultimately to a supervised account in Qatar.
Right, but if, as you say, under the previous administration, and I'm going to take a little bit of issue with that momentarily, but if, as you say, Iran was able to spend down money in similar accounts that have been set up in Brazil and India, why were there not the same concerns from banks?
In the previous administration, so I'm not going to speak to why banks were willing to participate in the previous administration. We did make a change at the outset of this administration where we made clear that the funds in this account could only be used for humanitarian purposes.
And are you suggesting that the previous administration allowed Iran to spend down money in these restricted accounts for nefarious purposes, or for purposes other than humanitarian assistance?
I will say that we don't know what they were used for, because we can find no record of how these funds were spent down. Certainly not that they were required to be. What we can say is that they were not required to be spent only for humanitarian purposes, and we can't tell what they were used for.
Okay. And once this money gets to the bank in Qatar, even though you say that it's restricted for use for humanitarian goods, items only, does that not allow, or does that not free up $6 billion from Iran's treasury, from its internal accounts, that they might otherwise have to spend on these same humanitarian items, and now they can spend it on, I don't know, arming the Houthis or supplying Assad with stuff, or even with, sending drones to Russia.
No, and here's why. I think it's important to remember that our sanctions regimes, not with respect to Iran and with respect to to all of the countries where we impose sanctions, have always contained exceptions for food, for medicine, for other humanitarian purposes. That has always been the case. That was the case with these accounts. It was difficult to transfer these accounts for the reasons, the money from these accounts for the reasons that we just went into. But it has always been Iranian money in accounts that was available to them for humanitarian purposes if they could be able to use it. But let me just say one other thing, which I do recognize that there are tough choices involved here, and the secretary has been forthright about this. He's been upfront about this. The president has been upfront about this. There are always tough choices involved in bringing home American citizens. But the president and the secretary have decided that their first priority is to bring these American citizens home, and that's why we agreed to this arrangement to do that.
You're not suggesting that somehow these restrictions impact fungibility of these funds?
No.
You're
I don't know what you say that again.
So if I have $1 and I give it to you, and that means that you have another, that a dollar that you have in your wallet you can use to spend on anything you want, and you don't have to worry about the dollar that I gave you, right?
So where that analogy breaks down, no one has given Iran a dollar here. These are Iran's funds. These are Iranian money. Well, you just said if I give you a dollar. I'm saying.
Well, I mean, if I give you a dollar out of an Iranian account that I have, stashed aside someplace, then they're able to spend a dollar on something else other than humanitarian funds, correct? And the other thing that I would take issue with, and especially these White House talking points, which are just disingenuous to the extreme. I mean, they must be intended for people who did not follow the whole JCPOA negotiation. Is that the if you give, let me start again. There is no suggestion by anyone, even the critics, unless they're completely uninformed critics, that this is U.S. taxpayer money. And that is no one has said that I'm aware of. And if they have, then it's wrong. No one is saying that. So that is like a straw man argument that you guys knock down all the time, saying this isn't U.S. taxpayer money, it's not coming out of the account. But the other thing is that when you say that they drew down.
Can I interrupt? I hesitate to ask to interrupt you. Interrupt me all the time. I don't really mind it. It is not a straw man argument. Only that if you peruse Twitter last night, you will find a number of elected officials who talk about how the United States is giving Iran money, which we are not doing. It is Iran's money. So there are people who are claiming that we are giving money, and we cannot give something that is not ours.
Well, yeah, but you're making it easier for them to get
I'm taking issue with the specific words. I'm just usually referred to as a straw man. There are people who have made that.
It's U.S. taxpayer money. But anyway, neither here nor there. And then secondly on this, when you say that that the previous administration allowed Iran to spend down these accounts, you don't know what they were spent on, and you can't account for any of it. So how do you know that they did?
We can see that the accounts have been spent down, other accounts, not these South Korean accounts, but the accounts for money that was purchased by other countries have been spent down. They were spent down without restrictions, requiring them to only be used for humanitarian purposes, and we cannot see what they were spent for.
How much was that?
I don't know at the top of my head. We may have that number. I'd be happy to look into it. Abby?